All right. Well, good morning. I'm Ken Dibray, and welcome to Coffee with Ken, a thought leadership series at the nexus of business and politics. In the news today, President Biden plans to release his budget proposal to Congress, and Broadway's longest running show, Phantom of the Opera, is set to close next month. Today's topic is the future of indoor agriculture, and we're thrilled by the panel we have today. Allison, Kopf, the Chief Growth Officer of IUNU, Matt Lingard, the Senior Vice President of Agriculture and Science at Bright Farms, Andrew Liao, Investment Professional at Generate Capital. Great seeing you guys. How are you?
Yeah, good.
Good. You started us on a sad note with the closing of the show.
I know. I was trying to think, like, how does that tie into
Phantom is closed.
Just Broadway closes, but farms open, right? So we can easily. Yeah. So let's start with you, Allison, since you wanna jump in. Give us a quick 101 on indoor agriculture. Like, what should people know? Like, where has this been? How long has it been going on? Like, I feel like it's all the rage and everyone's talking about it now.
Sure, and I think the important thing to know is indoor ag has been around for a really, really long time, right? We've been growing in greenhouses for a long time. If you look to the Netherlands, you look outside of the United States, the market has been growing in protected ag for a long time. And the reason is because it is a better way to grow for a lot of crops, right? It extends the seasonality of your crop. And so it allows you to protect against the risk of weather and all of the changes that are happening in our climate right now. And so folks have been doing this for a really long time. But if we kind of pivot to the US a little bit, I think of it as three phases of growth here. The first happened in the around 1980s to kind of today, when we look at the tomato industry. So if we look at tomatoes, none of the tomatoes that we eat in the United States were grown in a greenhouse environment pre-1980, none. Today, the majority of tomatoes that we consume are grown in greenhouse environments. And that shift happened because of that efficiency mechanism, right? Like the fact that you can extend your growing cycle, you could do it more efficiently, you could protect against the risk of weather and downside. All of that led to the industry shifting into greenhouse environments. And we're seeing that same thing happen now in other crops. We're seeing it happen in cucumbers and peppers and eggplants, in lettuce and leafy greens and herbs, in berries potentially is kind of the next segue in. And so phase two became this rise of maybe the venture-backed greenhouse in around 2010, 11, where venture capital got really excited about this because they saw the opportunity to shift those dynamics of the food system. And so you saw the rise of companies like Matt's, like Bright Farms, like Arrow Farms, like Freight Farms and Farmed Here, some of which don't exist anymore, some of which do and have made that jump to scaling. But you saw this kind of rise of companies, except for that everybody had to build all the technology and everything themselves because it didn't really exist off the shelf. So people were building their own greenhouses and their own growing systems and their own software and their own LED lights. And now we've shifted to this kind of phase three, which is the scaling phase. And so now we see companies like Generate Capital and innovative financing parties and ag lenders coming into the space, which makes the cost of construction come down, the cost of building comes down, the knowledge has scaled, so we can actually build more greenhouses and vertical farms kind of all around the country. And we're starting to really see this rapid scale. So like the tomato industry, we're seeing the same thing happen in the lettuce industry, but exponentially faster because we've just learned so much in a short amount of time. And then I think kind of to tease the future is now we can think about automation and we can think about really kind of amplifying and exponentially growing that scale, which is kind of what we're starting to get into now, where people don't have to build their own systems or technologies because it exists. So at a highest level, that's maybe a primer, but Matt, Andrew, you guys can jump in if I missed anything too.
Yeah, listen, Matt.
Yeah, the only thing I would jump in and add is, the way Allison laid that out is perfect. And
that's why she would first. I mean, that's why.
No, it's exactly why I would never have started otherwise. But you take a look and it's really been the high value crops that we got in first. And so tomatoes commanded a higher price. They're a robust crops. So the technology level didn't have to be nearly as high as it has to be actually for lettuce, which is kind of frankly a wussier crop. I think the one that got left out was marijuana and the importance of marijuana going indoors. And as a very high value crop, it really drove a lot of technology advancements in the CEA industry that, particularly in LEDs and in climate controls that I think frankly paved the way to get to these harder to grow, more commodity style crops like lettuce.
Fascinating. So what's I think fun about the three of you is you're all kind of in different buckets in this ecosystem, right? With like Allison kind of, on the technology side, Matt, you're actually like growing stuff. And Andrew, you're really on the kind of economic side, the investment side, right? Like talk us through this, right? Like what kind of dollars, who plays in this? Is it a VC, private equity, family office, debt? Like, what are the economics here? And I mean, how should investors be thinking about it?
Yeah, so I think most of the $3+ billion that's poured into this space, it has been venture and private equity capital, and that was really important, as Allison noted, to get things going, right? But this is pretty high risk capital, needs to exit quickly, needs to make 10x returns, and sometimes this can push founders to grow too quickly or maybe overemphasize internal tech development. When they could actually be outsourcing a lot of that to companies like IUNU, right? So this can lead to some bad financial strategic decisions sometimes. While VC is important for funding IP and product development, I think the actual nuts in both of these farms should be financed with more long-term capital, whether it's from infrastructure investors like Generate or from family offices like Cox. I think what's interesting at Generate is we're set up as a corporation. So we never have to or plan to exit our investments, right? Which means that we can make steady returns over a period of decades and can really ride the commodity cycles. And also because we never have to exit our investments, we have this deep portfolio of capabilities we can bring to the table. So we could finance your greenhouse. We could also provide you a microgrid or composting, anaerobic digestion. I know family offices like Cox also have this wide variety of services they can provide. And so I think investors and developers, should start looking at other types of capital instead of just your standard VC and PE.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised. Like you referenced Cox, so Cox Enterprises out of Georgia, I think is a big investor or owner with Bright Farms. Right now, talk a little bit about that.
That's right.
That come about. I think of Cox, and I think kind of like little older institutional kind of family operation. I didn't really think that they would be the type of partner on something like this. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So Cox had been our lead investor for many, many years during the first 7 or 8 years that Bright Farms existed as a startup company. Became our lead investor, and then in 2021 bought the company entirely. And so Bright Farms is a wholly owned subsidiary of Cox Enterprises today. And as you say, that it's a really surprising thing to figure out when you realize that Cox Enterprises owns Cox Cable, and so a lot of people in the U.S. get their cable from Cox. They also have a really large pillar around the automotive industry. They own companies like Kelley Blue Book and Auto Trader. The Cox family, it's a family-owned company. It's been around for over 100 years. They're also keenly interested in green tech and how to effectively give back in the way that they with the money that they've been able to generate from these businesses. And Bright Farms became their first acquisition in this space. It's a really key moment because, kind of like Andrew was saying, these kind of greenhouse investments, these green tech investments, they require a long time horizon. They don't pay back in a year. They don't pay back in a 2-year period of time. They're much more like a utility, which is exactly the type of company that Cox has been. And so the partnership for us has been amazing. It's given us the space to really work out the kinks without being under the microscope of public scrutiny that comes with being a publicly traded company, for example. And so I think taking that long view is so very critical to seeing long-term success in this sector.
So let's pivot to technology now, right, Allison? So like, where does IUNU fit in? What kind of technology are you talking about? Like, who are your customers? What are you offering them? And where are you headed in terms of like meeting new demand for tech?
Yeah, and I'll actually take a pivot from the financing conversation, because I think one of the important things in the industry right now is that we're in the phase where we're starting to see indoor ag become its own asset class, which is really an interesting kind of shift. And part of that, and so similar to real estate, like we're seeing a lot of these mirrors come over from real estate financing. But one of the important pieces of becoming an asset class is predictability. And so that's where technology can play this huge part. So at IUNU, what we're focused on is both the data collection side. How do you automate all of the data collection that happens on a farm and introduce new data sets that maybe are either difficult to collect because they're too labor intensive or are impossible to collect because you can't see it with the human eye. We do that using computer vision and artificial intelligence. And then the second half is actually implementing different crop strategies based on that information. So how do you actually execute your operational changes based on the information that you now have? And that's kind of the umbrella that we're focused on.
Wow, that's incredible. So let me pivot back to Matt real quick. I'm looking at your background, right? This is a full-on greenhouse. Talk about the different types of indoor ag, right? Like if you're in New York City, Allison and I used to spend time in New York, it was straight vertical farming became the hot commodity, right? Biophilia in buildings now. How are you growing on walls for wellness as people think about coming back to the office, right? It's not indoor ag per se, but it's kind of in that vein. So like talk a little bit about Green roofs. I mean,
Green roofs. Yeah.
One.
Yep. So people have been growing plants for 10,000 years, really, when we think about agriculture in general. And this indoor ag is really the tip of the spear when I think about what the future of agriculture looks like in the world. And the two flavors that have predominantly emerged over the last 10 years are, roughly categorized in my mind as horizontal and vertical. And so the vertical is the one that gets all the press. It's you see the pictures of the factories that can been converted into growing spaces, 100% artificial lights, 100% artificial climate control. It's a very high tech, very tech focused way of growing. I tend to refer to this way of growing as technologists who happen to farm when I think about it.
Okay.
And then when you look at what's in my background, we grow in greenhouses. And so we grow in horizontal farms as opposed to the vertical. And so that glass at the top lets sunlight through. We get the majority of our lighting from the sun. Lighting is the major input cost for most of these indoor farms. And so by using sunlight, we're able to defer or offset the cost of growing indoors. We also do venting to the outside environment. And so we have netting over the vents to keep any kind of the bad stuff out and the good stuff in, but we're able to kind of get rid of the excess humidity that the vertical farms really struggle with. I tend to refer to indoor farming or to the horizontal greenhouse farming as farmers who happen to use technology. All farmers use tons of technology today. I've been in the agriculture industry for 15, 16 years. If you're out in fields, like you'll see drones, you'll see tons and tons of tech. We take that to kind of the next level when we go into greenhouse, more technology, but our focus is produce high quality, nutritious food first, and we'll use whatever technology we need to do that efficiently. We tend to want to partner rather than build and invent ourselves. Andrew referred to that. You can get you're way over your skis in this space if you want to build it all and invent it all first. When we look at the best in class in the lettuce industry, for example, most people, thinking now about field operations of large scale, they're partnering with companies like IUNU. They're partnering with others to bring in the talent that they don't have internally. I'm really proud to say we've been working with IUNU for the last 5 years. And a big part of that's because we recognize the importance of the type of technology that Allison's talking about to be efficient with the way that we grow in our greenhouses.
And Andrew, when you're thinking about the investing side of this, are you looking at companies? How do you manage deal flow? Like, where are you trying to play? Is it across this entire sector, like with the tech in ag, with real estate, with ownership, like distribution? Like, how far is Generate thinking about going, and how deep in whatever aspect of this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one thing that we pride ourselves at Generate is the sort of diversity of services and capital we provide, right? So we can do project capital. We could also do corporate capital. We can do debt and equity. Because we're set up as a public benefit corporation rather than a fund, we have a lot of flexibility in how we deploy that capital and what strategies we pursue. One example of that is, piggybacking what Matt was saying, there's a raging debate if you peek behind the curtain in the sector. People in the sector like to debate, what's better, greenhouses or vertical farms? And at Generate, we think both make sense, right? When there's low natural light, when there's scarce land, when there's, low cost renewable energy, vertical farms can make a lot of sense, right? If there's a lot of natural light, greenhouses are the original solar farm, right? There's climate, have cheap land. And then even, when you have large scale automated greenhouses, sometimes if you want more smaller batch items, you can source from local vertical farms, local container farms. And so, at Generate, we tend to be very open-minded about what type of technologies, what type of capital we can provide. And, that's something I think really distinguishes ourselves.
Nice. Well, Allison, one of the things that we love talking about on this kind of show is this nexus of business and politics, right? And government, and the role of government and nonprofits, and how all of this kind of comes together in society. Like, how is government involved, right? And let's maybe bifurcate the question into and for all three of you, right? Like, at the federal level, there's obviously huge lobbying as it relates to food and agriculture, et cetera. So where does indoor agriculture or protected ag fit in? And then even at the local level, from an educational perspective, how do policymakers, what do they need to know about this, right? From a zoning perspective, a land use perspective, things seem to be moving pretty quick. And, sometimes I worry that even at the local level, we're not, staying ahead of the curve for market needs and demands.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So in agriculture, you have a bunch of different levers being pulled always, and it's been this way since the beginning of government, right? And so, the Farm Bill, for example, covers a lot of things in agriculture. It covers how we think about subsidies. It covers how we think about crop insurance. It covers just a ton of things, down to things like farmers markets and how you set up farmers markets. It's just pretty all encompassing. And it's at the federal level, but covers everything all the way down to your local sort of community level. And the challenge I think that indoor ag has faced for a really long time is it's been mostly excluded from a lot of these bills. And the reason is because it's considered protected agriculture. And so there's this assumption that when you're growing in an indoor environment, you are eliminating all of the things that outdoor field ag producers have to deal with, whether it's weather conditions or pest conditions or disease, which we all know is not the case, right? We still have a hugely biological environment that we're growing in, whether you're growing in a completely protected environment or not. There's still sun conditions you have to think about.
Sure.
There's heating conditions you have to think about. There's pest and disease, of course, in a facility. Now, it may be reduced, but that doesn't mean it's eliminated. And so to date, a lot of these things around crop insurance and all these things at the federal level have excluded protected ag from that. And that's where I think there's now a lot of attention is how do we shift that to become a more inclusive food system that involves CEA and controlled environment ag in the equation. Some of the things that we think about on the federal side are how do we think about the challenges that are unique to CEA, controlled environment ag, where their government could play a role, right? So a really easy one on this is broadband access and Wi-Fi and connectivity, right? So we think about where we're placing greenhouses, but as you start thinking about locating in rural areas, you're facing a whole new slew of issues, right? You're facing access to talent challenges, you're facing connectivity challenge, you're facing distribution challenges, all of which are huge components of running a farm. And so we want to be a more connected country. We want to have more access to Wi-Fi connectivity, and yet farms struggle to get access to that connectivity. So when we think about this automated future of a farm, well, what do you need? You need Wi-Fi, right? We need to be able to connect and we need to be able to do those things, but it can be hugely and prohibitively cost prohibitive, right? And because it's ultimately a farm, we've got low margins here. So I think those are areas where we can look to where government can play a role in extending the ecosystem that is CEA to get access across rural areas and urban areas, and thinking about how we bring those two areas together, frankly, through all of these different challenges that we face in farming that are unique to farming and maybe not necessarily the same across all industrialized ecosystems.
Yeah, the two things I would add to that are labor and research. And so the labor laws for agriculture are written assuming seasonality. And so, specifically that, there's a harvest season. And so you can temporarily employ 100 workers to come and harvest your field, and then you're going to not have them a month later. We employ people 365 days a year and don't have access to the same types of tax incentives, et cetera, that when we think about labor. And so it just simply wasn't in the calculations or in the awareness when a lot of these laws were written. The other piece is research. And so, and all of these things are really like a reflection of the fact that the vast majority of agriculture today is still outdoor field grown. When we think about corn and soy, that's the lion's share of what's grown today. And then even in the commodities and the vegetables, it's still mostly grown in California. And so the dollars follow that. And so what we need to do to really continue to move this field forward is see research dollars moving into extension offices for thinking about how we practically grow in greenhouses, and into the types, food safety research for CEA environments, into crops that are developed specifically for indoor agriculture and controlled environment agriculture. And so I think the Farm Bill has a lot to say with where those dollars are apportioned as well.
Interesting. Andrew, how are you thinking about this? And maybe even through the lens of like more urban areas, right? If you're thinking about food deserts, and to piggyback kind of a little bit on the Cox reference, Cox also acquired a firm called Axios, which is a newsletter that everybody here in DC loves and reads. And they had an interesting piece the other day about the conversion of office buildings to residential. And they did an overlay of grocery stores. And it was fascinating to think in DC, if you start converting some of these office buildings to residential, there's literally no grocery. So like even the access to food kind of challenges, and should we be thinking about office buildings as vertical farms in the future, right? Like, how do we think about our assets in urban core? So,
yeah, I love that idea.
But so you have this complicated graphic, so I feel like you can answer this complicated.
Yeah, I can point it out on each one behind me. So, I sit in New York, right? And we're seeing, less people come in the office. So, people are thinking of alternate uses for all of these buildings. I think indoor ag is a great way to address that issue. And certainly as an investor, that's one of the top things in mind when developers, entrepreneurs come to us. Where are you siting your project, and then what is the regulatory environment at your project, right? And this is so important because, the average county or municipal engineer Like they've never seen an indoor farm. So they have no idea how to zone it. They have no idea what kind of permitting or building codes are involved. So there's this huge education process that has to happen. And you really need some agency or a champion in government to be there to hold everyone's hand and push things through. And so, I can't emphasize enough how important it is, to have a strong regulatory and government backing for any project.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We've alluded a little bit to talent. Like, I imagine each of your verticals, the talent hunt may vary, but talk a little bit about that. Maybe Allison, we'll start with you. Like, these are like, you could be getting tech executives out of the Bay Area working in indoor farms, right? I mean, like, how do you think about recruitment, retention, the hunt for talent, what type of talent?
Yeah, so on an internal basis, that's exactly right. So we think about this as both experts from the industry as well as tech experts and sort of folks from the tech industry. And so when you look at our team, probably about half of the team has experience growing commercially or operating commercial greenhouses or vertical farms. And so that's really, really important to us because it helps us not understand how to build the right product for our customers and understand what our customers are going through because we've been there. But also it helps us actually diagnose a lot of the challenges that we see through the data. And so we have an entire horticulture team, for example, that's comprised of horticulturalists, trained horticulturalists who have worked commercially their entire careers, who are experts in things like pest management, disease management, growing. And so it helps because we can actually deploy them to customer sites to make recommendations and things and work with the team on their plans as they start kind of understanding what's happening in the data. On the other side of this, you have the tech side, right? And so we have to build really complex artificial intelligence technology. That skill set is not rampant, right? Like not everybody can do this. And so we have to find computer vision engineers. We have to find artificial intelligence engineers. We have to find great software engineers. So we're always looking for that kind of pool of tech talent that makes up kind of the other half of the team. And then there's kind of a smattering of other folks in the middle, right? If you're in customer success or sales, you may kind of cross over between those two fields. You may understand technology, but you may also understand the horticulture space. So we're kind of in that 50-50. I think it's something that makes us relatively unique. But I will say on the labor side, this is one of the biggest challenges in our industry, not just on our side. Of course, we would love to have more AI engineers in the world. And if you're out there and you're looking for a job, please call us. But we'd also love to have more growers, right? We've got a massive grower shortage. So we talked about the fact that we're in the scale phase of this industry. But if you open up a new facility today, finding a qualified grower to run that facility is really, really difficult because we don't have people waking up every morning saying, I want to farm anymore. It's just not a job that people think about anymore. And as much as people want to get into this industry, maybe from the technology side or from the operating side, we don't have the grower talent. And so that's something where technology, particularly what we're doing at IUNU, this is what we think about every day is how do we help growers operate many, many facilities across many locations? How do we think about scaling one great grower across lots of different locations? How do we think about the accessibility of that talent pool in not just any location, but across the organization as a whole? Because that's something that we're all going to have to deal with at some point right now.
Yeah. Matt, why don't we go to you now? I mean, I know you have a facility. I'm in the DC area. You have a great site down in Culpeper, Virginia, for example. And, I think one of the benefits of something like that is like when I go to my local grocery store in Fairfax County, like I can get Bright Farms lettuce, right? Like it's fascinating proximity, but to talk about the talent dynamic and maybe how you find people.
Yeah, and Allison covered a lot of really great points. I think when I look at how, kind of the lettuce version of this industry started, it was started by disruptors. And those disruptors often weren't farmers. They were people coming out of the tech industry, out of the finance industry. We frankly, as Bright Farms, been going through, in some ways, a correction where we realized, like Allison said, that we need to bring in more people with a background in food and agriculture, et cetera, to frankly, figure out what parts we're disrupting and what parts we're just taking the best of what people know how to do presently, right? And so what we think we're disrupting is kind of what you referenced, Ken. We want to get production out of one region of the U.S., so Salinas, California, Yuma, Arizona, and we want to put the areas of production closer to where people consume the food. This reduces the amount of miles that food travels. It keeps it fresher. We see the nutrition stays higher for longer. We do that though, and now we're facing how do we find people to work at these farms? 100 years ago, 90% of the people in the US worked in agriculture, right? Today, under 5%, right? It's a very small number and going down, right? Most people working in agriculture are in their 60s. And so most people who work in greenhouses, the state of the art for 50 plus years has been a 15 to 20 year apprenticeship so that you learn how using your 5 senses to control the climate inside of this greenhouse. You feel that it's a little too hot, you feel that it's a little too humid, you use your sensors to validate that, and then you go make a change. Today, we're bringing in really young, really talented people that are coming right out of the university. We often will bring them in through an intern program. Again, like Allison said, if you want to grow crops, come talk to me. We're always hiring. We bring in interns, we bring in apprentices, and we attempt to teach how to grow. The reality is, though, it's still a very long learning process, and there's a lot of complexity. It's surprisingly difficult to manage all of the different settings inside of a greenhouse like this. We look to technology to answer part of that problem as well. And so, this is why we're partnered with IUNU when we have digital systems that learn and remember, they don't forget, they don't leave to go to somewhere else, do something else. And so I think to me, there's really 2 sides of this equation. There's how do we bring in great talent and train them up and do that really efficiently and quickly? And then how do we provide digital tools? I think of this a lot like a self-driving car. Nobody has a car that drives itself today, really, but we have, in the pursuit of these self-driving cars, we've gotten so many great safety features like lane keep assist, assisted braking, et cetera. We need the equivalent of those additional safety features in greenhouses to keep from kind of running the greenhouse off the road, if you will, when it comes to managing the climate.
Yeah, if I can add to that, Ken, also, I got to say, over my 15-year career, I've seen the solar sector start off as kind of a niche, expensive technology and basically exponential scale to, grid parity, ubiquitous technology. And I think the one thing holding the indoor ag sector back from that is the talent and the labor, right? In the energy sector, you have thousands of professionals getting churned out of graduate programs all the time. And you still, people like Matt are basically unicorns. I think that's the top thing we need to look for as investors, good growers, and why it's so important to have IUNU to supplement them. So I think until we have more growing programs, more education around that, that will be somewhat of a break on the development of indoor ag.
And just one thing.
Just a small thing is when we're talking about government opportunities, training is a big one, right? We skip that, but companies like Bright Firms have great training programs internally, but how do we do this externally? How do we do public-private partnerships, right, with universities? How do we bring that talent pool up? Now, it's not going to affect us tomorrow, but it will when the industry is starting to scale 10, 20 years from now, right? Sure. So that's important as well.
So there's a perception issue as well, which is that kind of agriculture is old-fashioned and it's not like a sexy field, if you will. One of the things I talk a lot about is ag is a STEM field: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. When you look at a greenhouse like this in particular, it's data scientists, it's engineers, it's biologists. Frankly, anthropologists become really important when you think about how do we drive acceptance of food and different types of ways of doing agriculture. And so it's a really exciting field that I think is poorly understood in some cases, and that leads to at times difficulty in attracting talent.
Listen, if ag wasn't cool, you wouldn't be on Coffee with Ken. Let's just be
there we go.
It's a sexy field.
Come on. So let's talk about macro site selection. So Matt, you alluded to kind of you're now going closer to consumers, right? Talk about that. And we had a question come in, somebody asking about Florida. Are there a lot of indoor ag locations in Florida? Are there concerns about hurricanes? As you kind of unlock the geography and the map to get food closer to people, how hard is it to find sites? I mean, we spend a little bit of time on the real estate and working with companies that are looking to do industrial, right? Or, different types of manufacturing. And in that sector, there's a lot of competition for sites, right? It seems like a very competitive time, whether it's solar companies, EV companies, clean tech, microchips, there's a lot happening in industrial lab space, right? And then all of a sudden you overlay that with indoor ag, the types of assets and zoning that's needed is probably, that sector. So how's the competition? How is it finding locations? How do you think about future growth and scale and the investment, right, Andrew, that then comes with that? Obviously, if you had just one big site and you were kind of scaling it, it's a little easier and cost effective probably than multiple sites, multiple markets, and so on.
I'll jump in there. So because we've just announced our major expansion program, and so we're going to be building about 40 acres of greenhouses over the next 2 years. And a big part of that process is the site selection bit. And so again, we're very fortunate to work with a company like Kopf, who's helping us with this process. And so we're looking at, we've just started construction outside of Yorkville, Illinois, for a farm up in that region. We're also moving south. And we talked earlier about advancements in technology. One reason why it's historically been difficult to grow in say, Texas or Georgia or Florida is those are hot, humid environments, and greenhouses frankly struggle with those environments.
Yeah.
Lots of sun, lots of humidity. You start to lose a lot of your traditional climate management tools. We're really excited about our new partnership with Kubo Greenhouses. Kubo has a really wonderful cooling technology where they're able to really efficiently use forced air cooling to keep crops like lettuce that are cool season crops. They like really cool weather. When we use Kubo technology and we partner with our growing provider at Green Automation to grow within these kind of mobile plant gutter systems, we're able to put cool air through the bottom of the plants, move it up above the canopy, and be able to efficiently recycle that cooled air and the other inputs that we put into that space. And so, that then takes us to what do we need out of a site? Well, we want to be close to the distribution centers for our customer partners, so grocery stores, Ahold delis, Kroger, Walmart. We also, and so being on those shipping lanes really matters, or the trucking lanes really matters. Access to natural gas, to power, or other really big considerations. And then of course the zoning and the permit requirements. I'm not the expert in that space in our company. There's other people who think a lot about those, but the site selection grid, if you will, it sometimes feels like you're like Xing out more boxes than you're checking, and it becomes a fairly time consuming, difficult part of the process.
Yeah, I'd add that a lot of developers try to do it themselves, and they always miss something, right? The soil conditions, biological cultural resources, utility connections, regulatory environment. I mean, in my mind, it's so important to have experienced and connected real estate specialists, to find and create these conditions.
Yeah, we've certainly learned a lot over the years in that exact space. And for example, if you put a greenhouse in a humid valley instead of up on the top of the valley, air currents aren't right for moving air efficiently through the greenhouse. And so even subtle things like that, angle of the sun. Sorry, Allison.
No, it's okay. I was going to say on the Florida specific question, I think, a lot of these answers that you're getting are specific from Matt's experience and from Andrew's experience, but you have to also think about site selection depends on what crop you're growing and what type of facility you're going to be building in. So if you look at Florida, there actually are a ton of greenhouses. If you look in Immokalee, for example, there's a ton of tomato greenhouses. So there historically has been a really good, strong greenhouse industry in Florida. Not growing necessarily leafy greens, although there are some companies in the area that are starting to grow leafy greens in Florida. But because the humidity and the hot climate actually works better for certain crops than it does for others, it just may mean that it's more expensive. And just a quick funny Florida story, technology companies also have to think about this. So we don't have to think about site selection, because the question about the hurricanes, which made me laugh a little bit, because we had to think about lightning proofing our system when we came to Florida, because a lot of the greenhouses are not what you see in sort of Matt's background. They're a little bit more open air because you can take advantage of your climate. And so when you're open air, you tend to have a lot of lightning. And so I was talking with one of the growers who's literally been struck by lightning twice, because you're walking around a greenhouse all the time, touching climate control systems and fans, and you're wandering around touching metal all the time. He's been struck by lightning twice. And so we had to actually lightning proof our whole system.
Now
Maybe that's
Andrew's
why
going
there's
to
a
call
later
his
footage,
insurance
everyone's getting struck
provider.
by lightning.
Andrew's going to call his insurance company now for risk mitigation on lightning. Yeah, good work. Good work.
Only for the open air ones, right?
No, but it is a good point, because it's like not all areas are created equal. Not all greenhouses are the same. They're for different crops, different things, vertical, etc. Talk about the disruption that's happening in the food supply chain, right? Like high level, like our food, like something I'm eating today, right? Like it could be grown 50 miles away, but it could go 300 miles away before it comes back to me, right? Like how does it exist today? And like, what's the disruption happening from a more controlled, ag environment?
Yeah, if I could start, like overall in the economy, you're seeing this broader movement away from like just-in-time manufacturing, right? Over the past few decades, it was whatever's lowest cost, and you order it last minute. I think today businesses and retailers are much more willing to pay more.
Oh no, so insightful.
Less volatility, more stability subject. Yeah, go on.
Perfect.
You cut off there, Andrew.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we thought it was lightning.
Yeah, could be. Overall, it's just businesses and retailers are willing to pay more for less volatility, more stability, right? And so that's what Indorag can provide.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, right? Or go ahead, Matt, if you want to jump in.
Go ahead, Allison.
So I'll add to that, like at the highest level, right? 90% of the lettuce, if we're looking at lettuce, is grown in Salinas Valley, California, or Yuma, Arizona in the winter. And so when you think about a supply chain challenge, we see it every single day, and you see it on the shelves. So anybody listening to this podcast right now, if you've seen the rise in cost of food on the shelves right now, you can see the lettuce prices have increased, and you've seen the lettuce shortage that we just faced a lot the last few weeks. And that is directly, that is directly related to the fact that we have a really, really centralized system that relies on production in one area, distribution to distribution centers across the country, and then supply to retail. And so where CEA and the controlled environment ag industry has a huge advantage is that it is a more stable production method. And you can kind of reduce that volatility that comes with those shortages. And we saw that in Canada this year. We saw it in the US this year. We directly see it with our wallets. We directly see it when we have a shortage around the holiday season, right? And greenhouses have the ability to actually produce during those periods of time, which creates an opportunity for all of these producers to build relationships with retailers and distributors to actually create a more stable food system that is reliable year round.
Yeah, to put a finer point on that, I think you look at what's happening in Yuma as we speak. So it's been a really cold season. There's been multiple frost events, just another big rain event that washed out a bunch of the fields that are out there. And so, you know, when you centralize everything into one location, you become vulnerable to the weather in that location. Massive disease problems in lettuce and field production at the moment as well. Now, greenhouses aren't invulnerable to diseases, but what happens is if you have, you know, say 5 or 6 8-acre greenhouses in 5 or 6 states, if there's a disruption, it's going to be local to that one greenhouse, and the cross supply between those is a much more reasonable thing to contemplate than some of what we see out of the field space out in California. The other thing that happens is you get a much fresher product. And so when you think about lettuce, you know, you cut that leaf off, it's the timer started the moment you harvest that leaf. And when we look at what happens today and present in the field agriculture model, this is the thing I think we're really disrupting when we think about indoor grown. In field model, there's a, you know, say 100-200 farmers that are all interacted with through various brokers. The lettuce gets harvested, it gets sent to a centralized facility where it's washed, it's packaged, it's processed, and then it's shipped off to the various distribution centers. And like you said, Ken, sometimes you're shipping it back, sometimes you're shipping it forward. It goes on this tremendously long journey that impacts the shelf life of the product. And so, you know, you've got 14 to maybe 18 days tops. And if you've used up 6 or 8 of those and just the travel and the processing, like, you know, how many of us have gone and bought a package of lettuce and brought it home, and like that day or a day later, it's already wilty and rotten. What we find is our customers really love our product because it stays fresh for so long, because within 24 hours of harvest, that product can be on a supermarket shelf and be brought home. So the shelf life part by itself is amazing. And then we're not also putting all this carbon into the atmosphere through the shipping and the various movement around the country. And so I think it's a interesting, I think really important concept for how we grow in the future, is to get more to a decentralized model where we put the production right next to the consumption.
So we'll do some rapid fires as we're winding down. It sounds like you guys are always at similar conferences, even since we were planning this, and you guys, there's a lot of like indoor ag stuff. I feel like now I'm getting geo-targeted. There's conference after, you know, event after event. How much collaboration connection is there domestically in the United States, overseas with other kind of innovators in, you know, Denmark or Norway, right? Like, is this a global effort, or is this still kind of a kind of, are you guys all US focused? I mean, how do you think about the world, right? Look at Andrew's map. I mean, he's thinking about the world. I mean, how we, you know, there's hunger everywhere. We did it just to kind of put a finer point on this. We had an early coffee talk in, like, you know, the middle of the pandemic with Billy Shore, who runs, you know, Share Our Strength and No Kid Hungry, right? And it was like, you know, people aren't hungry in America or around the world because there isn't enough food. It's just like a legit, we just can't get it to them, right? Like, we literally have enough food on this planet to feed everybody, but we just don't, right? Like, you know, how much is this a global effort versus, you know, still, because government's not as involved in what you're doing day to day, more of a kind of private sector US focus? I know it's a lot, but 30 seconds each. I don't know.
Yeah, as I think about collaboration, I think one of the big differences between what's been happening over decades in Europe and the US is, in Europe, they're much more in an ecosystem where, you know, there's third-party technologists, third-party, you know, suppliers of data technology, and they work together really well, and that's helped grow the sector a lot. I think here in the US, because there's been so much maybe VC capital that requires every company to become a unicorn, I think the companies tend to be a little less collaborative, and we're seeing that change now, and hopefully chats like this and other different engagements can help change that.
Yeah.
It's also been a limited pool of capital to tap into, right? So that creates competition by nature, even if you're not trying to become the biggest or open the best or whatever it is, which everybody is, of course. But if there's limited pools of capital to tap into and you're all trying to scale, so you all need access to that capital and talent, right? Capital, talent, all these things. If there are limited pools, which we've already established in the US because it was a nascent market 20 years ago, that there are limited pools, then it has to become competitive by nature because you're all fighting for the same resources. So that has been the nature in the US, but there is a lot of collaboration happening cross-border. So you talk about kind of the Dutch to US collaboration that's happening, right? Matt mentioned Kubo, like a lot of the vendors in this space, for example, who have been around for decades and decades and decades are Dutch. And so when you think climate control companies, when you think greenhouse companies, when you think greenhouse builders, a lot of those companies are Dutch. It's not to say that there aren't great vendors in the United States or across North America, there are, but a lot of them are Dutch. And so you have this collaboration between the two. I'm sure Matt will talk about the breeding side, right? When we think about seed production and the relationships that growers have with breeders, a lot of those guys are Dutch, right? And so there's this global presence when it comes to the technology and the vendor and the greenhouse and the seed breeding side and the research side that has to by nature be collaborative. And then that starts to drive some of this collaboration as more pools of capital become available, as more of the technology becomes off the shelf, as the competition for resources kind of comes down a little bit, it opens up the doors to be a little bit more collaborative.
Great. Matt, close us out.
Yeah. So really great comments by both Andrew and Allison on that. I think, so our greenhouse provider is from Holland. Our growing system provider is from Finland. We look to the globe for seed breeding, for talent, et cetera. So I think when we think about like what goes into the industry, lots and lots of collaboration. The inter-industry collaboration, I think, is still a nascent space. It's still, and Allison cited it properly. It's not just capital, it's talent. There's not enough cross-pollination yet that's happening between these companies. I think because of that competition for resources and attention, I see that coming as the industry matures and it gets bigger. And I think it's really important. The other thing we have to think about is kind of, again, the roots of this are in the tech sector, which is a really IP heavy space. And so people want to protect their intellectual property. When I take a step back and look at, what we're doing, for example, I think so much of this comes down to excellence in operation and ability to execute really, really efficiently. I don't think there's so much secrets, right? That we need to be so protective that we can't be a little more open, a little more collaborative with others. And I think as the industry starts to realize that it's not your special software system that you built to run your vertical farm or your greenhouse, it's really about how do you consistently get people to do the things that you need them to do, and how do you use data systems like IUNU to do that. Collaboration will go up dramatically.
That's amazing. So is anybody growing coffee indoors yet? Like what's going on? Guys.
You'll find it. You can find it indoors. There's not a lot of.
I'm so persuaded. I feel like I should be starting indoor coffee now. Getting there. I want to thank all three of you for being on today. This is a ton of fun, super educational. Thanks for dumbing it down for me and for everybody tuning in. I know you guys have super sophisticated indoor ag conversations all the time. So this was, great and super well-rounded. So thank you all. Appreciate everybody tuning in and watching today. The video from today, as well as past sessions, are going to be on coffeewithken.com. And our next session is going to be next Wednesday on EV acceleration with Albert Gore III. Hope you can tune in there. And we just announced Lynn Martin, the president of the New York Stock Exchange, is joining us on April 20th. So exciting times. Check us out. And thanks everyone for tuning in, and good to see you guys.